And 30 years ago, the name of Lord Dawid Owen, Cyrus Vance, and Thorvald Stoltenberg were common names in the Balkans and in the story about the Balkans. Lord Dawid Owen was co-chair of a peace conference for the Balkans region, if we can say that. For years and years, he didn't spoke for Balkans media, but now he speaks. Lord Owen, welcome to program N1.
Very nice to be with you.
Lord Owen, let me start you with the current events before we speak about the past. At the moment, we have a couple of contagious issues in the world. One is Ukraine, another one is the Middle East, and another one is situation in the United States with the presidential elections. In 70s, you were probably one of the first foreign ministers of United Kingdom who visited Middle East, Israel and Palestine. How do you see the situation over there at the moment?
It's very bad indeed. And I think that Israel has to rethink its attitude, and particularly to what is going on in Gaza. There are good news that the present settlement proposals put forward by the US Secretary of State Blinken have been accepted by Netanyahu. But the problem with Netanyahu in recent years is that he's not as reliable as he used to be. And if he says he agrees it, you're looking for the small print and not sure that he does. Hamas, of course, anyhow, has to agree it as well. But I think Israel is needing to rethink its political posture before the rest of the world, and particularly its friends. I count myself as a friend of Israel. I have many Israeli friends. My wife was a literary agent and was the agent for a very important Israeli writer, Amos Oz. So I know the country well. I was the first foreign minister from Britain to visit Israel even. But they need now to think in a gentle way across their political divides to try to reach a consensus which seems to have disappeared from Israeli politics.
Is he wrong in his politics at the moment, especially because he surrounded himself with the far right in Israel, such as the Minister of Security and Minister of Finance? Has he betrayed the policies and politics of people like Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, who tried to get the peace in the broader Middle East, but especially between Israeli and Palestinians, especially through your friend Thorvald Stoltenberg through Oslo in '93?
I think Oslo has had its role, and I don't honestly think you can go back to Oslo. I think it's much more meaningful to look at the accords which have been put forward by the Americans, and in particular their young negotiator in the Trump administration, who was married to one of Trump's daughters. I think that the Abraham Accords offers a way out now, and there's no doubt that many of the key Arab countries are ready to enter into an arrangement with Israel on a regional basis, predominantly on economic issues. And I think that is the way forward. And the sooner those negotiations can get back underway. Why did Hamas take the action it did? Many people believe it was to stall the Abraham Accord discussions, that they feared it and they tried to bust it. The best way we can recover from all the problems of Gaza would be to go back into the Abraham Accords, and the sooner the better, and that is not dependent on Hamas agreement.
Let me ask you about Ukraine. United Kingdom is playing a significant role there, especially was playing a role in times of Boris Johnson's premiership. How do you see the situation there, and can this war be resolved under the Labour government of Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I'm Labour, and I've been Labour all my life. At times I broke away from Labour and formed the Social Democratic Party when they went, in my view, crazy on many domestic and foreign policy issues. But those days are over. But on the other hand, my own political life is over. I'm not an active politician. But I'm very pleased that Labour's back in government. I think Prime Minister Starmer has had a very good start. And I think that it's encouraging. And so I'm, if you like, back in harness. I'm not, as I say, active Labour, but I have no grievance with the present government, and I think they've made a good start.
What about Ukraine? Are they doing a good job? And what's the role of United Kingdom? Should they play a different role, or this role is proper at the moment to help Ukraine?
When Ukraine first invaded, it was invaded by Russia, and Angela Merkel was German Chancellor, and we had a different government in Britain. We took much too relaxed a view of it. That was overt military action, which should have been met with very tough diplomatic policy. After the second invasion, I think the British policy became very much better, and we have to accept we are not going to have a peaceful world if we allow countries like Russia to invade, as they consider for some historic reasons, which in my view are not valid. But anyhow, there are no way that you can justify the invasion of Ukraine, and it was right for the NATO countries to come together and say that we would help Ukraine with defensive arms, which is exactly what we've done. We are not governing Ukraine. We are not making military decisions in Ukraine. We are helping Ukraine after an outrageous assault from Russia.
Your friends and colleagues' son, Jens Stoltenberg, is leading NATO at the moment, and he will be at the helm for just a few more months, and then Mark Rutte is taking over. Did Jens Stoltenberg play a good role as a head of NATO in this situation? And would it be different if someone else was at the helm of NATO when all this started some 2.5 years ago?
Well, Jens Stoltenberg, in my view, has been one of the very best NATO Secretary Generals. It's been an exhausting and difficult job for him, and he's done it with great skill, of course, helped by having had the earlier experience of being Prime Minister of Norway. And I'm sure if his father was still alive, he'd feel very proud of him, and he certainly should. So I think he's done his level best and has led NATO very well. I'd be sad to see him go. We don't know exactly who is going to be his successor, but the name that is spoken of a lot is Luntz, the Holland's former prime minister, and a very able man, I may say. So if he does come in, I think he'll do a good job, but I'm sure whoever is chosen will be good.
You have a lot of experience with the world leaders and different political setups, but United States are in a turmoil at the moment, with President Trump potentially coming back and all potential disruptions out of that. How do you see this situation? If he comes back, should we be worried about the world and Western coalition in the North Atlantic setup, or the alliance is strong and it will survive another 4 years of Donald Trump?
It survived 4 years of Donald Trump. It was nowhere near as bad as people often made it out to be, but his own language didn't help. I think recently he's very definitely pulled back from the idea that he's hostile to NATO, and I think it'd be much easier to deal with. Broadly speaking, he respected the military, and broadly speaking, agreed with them when they argued against some of his policies. So it's a two-way traffic back in the Pentagon with the president if Trump is elected. And I don't believe you can make great criticisms of him. His main issue with NATO is an issue on which I hold exactly the same views. We cannot continue without NATO itself spending more money than the United States, and in very considerable increase in the financial contributions from some member states. It's improved a little over the last year. It needs to improve a lot more. You cannot expect the American public, miles away from Europe, very uninterested in a large thing, to continue to support politicians on support for NATO. They have to be seen to be supported predominantly by ourselves and not on American contributions. Provided we get that financial balance back, and we are getting it slowly back better, then I think American relations within NATO will be good, and I don't see any problems with President Trump. But he's yet to win the election. We may have a new president and the first woman president. So let's see.
What about EU? How they are playing their role at the moment?
Well, as you probably know, I was in favor of Britain leaving the EU, but these were for distinctive British reasons. It is not itself a condemnation of the EU. I think the EU does a very difficult job. It's a very necessary, large regional organization. And I think that I would go on encouraging countries in and around the Balkans who are not members to become members. And I don't want anybody to be under any illusion that my view of why Britain should leave the EU was British reasons. And it was not in any way the result of what I did for nearly 3 years in the Balkans. I was supported very firmly by all of the EU foreign ministers. Whenever any criticism came from the Parliament, well, it's entitled to make, they always supported me. I cannot complain at all from the way the EU treated me during that very, very difficult mission that was to say went for nearly 3 years. Fortunately, I was out of that post before Srebrenica. And of course, there are many consequences of Srebrenica, not only the genocide, but the political consequences. And I've avoided much comment. I felt, don't foul the pitch for my successors. But I, for all its difficulties and immensely hard work and dangers, being away from my family for nearly 3 years, I'm glad I did that job in the Balkans. And I look on it as a necessary sacrifice to older people to use their experience. I only wish I could have been more successful.
Lord Owen, let me ask you something about that time in the Western Balkans. You said at the start of what was going on here in the Western Balkans, especially about Bosniaks, don't live under this dream that the West is going to come and sort the problem out. Many have criticized you about that when you said that in 1993. So can you elaborate a bit what that meant then, but also what means now for Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, I was right, didn't I? I mean, the war went on from 1993, 1994, 1995. It was only really brought to a head by NATO having to intervene after the genocide in Srebrenica. The appalling nature of the Srebrenica genocide drew attention to the false claims of safe areas, which Vance and I, and then Stoltenberg and I, had constantly opposed because we knew they weren't safe. They didn't have enough UN soldiers. They were going to be overrun. And when they were overrun, there would have been a tragedy. And we didn't predict, of course, that tragedy would be so deep and so horrible as the genocide. But I think I was right to tell people, you've got to solve a lot of these problems yourself. We can help. We can be around and hold the ring a little, but we are not part of the Balkans. And it still is the case that the problems of the Balkans are within the Balkans and must be solved fundamentally there. But I do think you can be helped, and I hope that you are getting diplomatic and other help I, it's difficult, I know, and I know that there are problems still with the settlement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but don't upset it. Don't give up that formula. You've got an agreement. You've got an agreement fully backed by the United States, and that will come with it the support of whoever wins the presidential election. Don't give up that framework. Stay within it and try and try and try again to get better agreement over some of the difficulties in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I think that it will be okay, but you've got to be persistent and don't chase after false settlements and raise issues about the boundaries and things like that. Nothing is immutable, but this is certainly no time to make any changes whatsoever in the Dayton Accords.
Another question here in the Western Balkans, which was mentioned often regarding you, is the following: that in your testimony in the case of Slobodan Milošević, you have said that, and I quote you, Tudjman was not the slightest bit ashamed or secretive. I mean, he made absolutely clear to everybody who talked to him that he believed that the substantial part of Bosnia and Herzegovina should be attached to Croatia, and he didn't accept that the Bosnia should be made into an independent country. And he took the view, whereas Mr. Milošević was spent less time on this issue, to be blunt. No doubt, had petty similar views, but he didn't talk about it as much. Have you ever spoke, for example, with President Izetbegović about intentions of Mr. Tudjman and Mr. Milošević regarding the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, many times. I mean, I had them all three in the same room. I had them, perhaps the most fruitful of all meetings, where we got very, very close to a settlement on HMS Invincible in the Mediterranean. And I begged President Tudjman to stay the night on board the ship, and I think we would have got a settlement. That was on, we were on the splitting Bosnia and Herzegovina in three ways. And indeed, we reached a settlement which I think back in Bosnia and Herzegovina was looked on as a very good possibility. And I think Izetbegović left the HMS Invincible believing he had a settlement, but it was not to be. Tudjman had very firm views. I remember once saying to him, "Why aren't you proud of what you did as part of the guerrilla warfare in the Second World War when you fought alongside with Tito?" He said, "It was the greatest mistake I ever made in my life." He was no doubt about it, a Croatian nationalist, and he probably, if you had to choose a winner, you'd have to admit he got most of what he wanted. And it's a stable Croatia now, and it's in the European Union. But I hope those many good people, political leaders in Croatia, will not give up because they're not part of the difficulties faced by Bosnia and Herzegovina, trying to play a fruitful role in solving helping to solve some of the problems that exist between Bosnia and Herzegovina and some other parts of the region. So I think Croatia can help, but they have got a settlement and it's worked well for them. And good luck to them.
During your time here, while you worked with late Cyrus Vance and Thorvald Stoltenberg, and before and after you, there were many plans to finish the war in Bosnia, but none of them have been fruitful till Srebrenica has happened. And in your same testimony in Milošević case, you said, and I quote you, "So these poor, unfortunate people of Srebrenica were, as far as the world is concerned, nominally living in a safe areas, safe havens, call them what you will. and they'd never been safe from the moment that the term has been applied to Srebrenica. Why the world has waited so long to make a pressure even bigger than yours and Vance's and Stoltenberg's and others, Kutillero, for example, on Milošević and Tudjman and Izetbegović to make the deal and to finish this before November of 95?
Well, you'd have to ask them. There's other people. The basic facts of it were that Milošević was playing many different roles. And we now know from some of the transcripts which have been emerged from the United States of America that Milošević was in contact with Mladić at the time of Srebrenica. I remember talking to Milošević on the phone in 1993, in the spring of 1993, about my worries about Srebrenica, and he shared them. And he said, this is a blood war between Bradanić, where the Serbs think they were massacred by the Muslims, and Srebrenica, only a few miles down the road, where the Muslims feel they've been massacred by the Serbs. And he actually intervened at my request. And I think that was, we averted a crisis. I'm afraid, I think that, Srebrenica happened after I left. So I think fairly knowledgeable about it. I'm certainly very interested in it, but it didn't happen on my watch, but it could have happened. It was always about to happen. The mistake was in the UN when Russia actually went along with the safe area policy and was almost persuaded in by the Americans to vote for safe areas. But Cyrus Vance, who was a fine man, courageous and honest man, and he and I told the Security Council, the word safe is an illusion. You are pretending to make it safe, but you're not giving us enough UN soldiers to make it safe, and it will cause more trouble than you think. It was an accident waiting to happen, Srebrenica. It didn't happen on my patch. If I'd been there, I would have done my utmost to persuade Milošević again to control Mladić and not let Mladić go in. And I might have been successful. By that time, I knew Milošević pretty well, and he knew me. Our weaknesses and our strengths, we probably both knew each other quite well. But I did find on a number of occasions that I was able to stop another Srebrenica, Srebrenica happening. But often it required almost abrasive discussions with Milošević. I spent many hours with him. I think he was involved in Srebrenica now, from what are the evidence that is beginning to grow. For a while, I thought it was just Mladić doing it on his own. But it's brought about a peace. It was so horrendous that NATO had to put in firepower from the air. And NATO bombed Serb troops to the negotiating table. Dayton didn't tell them about because of negotiations. It came about because NATO hit Serb forces, Bosnian Serb forces. So of course, we know that was mixed up with Serb forces. And it came about because military action was used. I openly called for military action throughout my 3 years as peace negotiator.
But why didn't happen?
You can't be a peace negotiator and advocate intervention. And I said, if you don't have some muscle behind your negotiations, you will fail. And we could not persuade NATO and the Americans to take action.
Who didn't listen to you at that time? Was that President Clinton in Washington?
Yes.
Was that Europe who didn't listen to you, or
no,
both of them?
President Clinton in Washington was the big obstacle. There was some resistance in Europe to using weapons, but we could persuade the European members of NATO to take up arms. What we could not persuade was the Americans to do so. They were absolutely reluctant to get involved. And, they made various policies, decisions. Lift and strike was one of their policies. Lift the embargo and strike from the air. And the then American Foreign Secretary touted this around. Halfway through his tour of Europe, he was disowned by Clinton. No, Clinton was an American of the generation of Vietnam, young when the Vietnam War took place, and was desperately afraid of getting dragged into what he saw could have become another Vietnam. I don't think it could. I don't think it was analogous in any ways. But it was American reluctance. We had a lot of cooperation from Russia and the UN forces. They were represented and were easily managed. Of course, they had different views on occasions, but the Russian played a role in UNPROFOR, a constructive role.
How much was understanding for your words and your role in Westminster or in Downing Street at that moment? John Major was the Prime Minister of United Kingdom. British media were now judged by their articles somehow against Muslims or Bosniak, as it's called at the moment, at that time. Did they listen to you enough and supported you enough in your role?
Well, I was looking at the papers only a few weeks ago. In December 1993, General Morion and I negotiated directly with the Izetbegovic and his military and with the Serbian politicians and the military. And we got within an ace of a ceasefire. We had to have the British warrior weapons, which were not tanks, but armored, to be on the ceasefire line in Sarajevo. And I asked the British to let me have those warriors from the UN. They were already there in Bosnia-Herzegovina. They were destined for Croatia, and they refused. They didn't want to get involved. That was a tragic mistake and a tragic error that I was not able to persuade the then British Prime Minister, but in particular, of course, the Defence Minister and quite a lot of people who didn't want to have UN forces and British troops in them anyhow.
Some of your successors at the position of a foreign secretary, two other lords, Douglas Hurd and Lord Carrington, it looked like they didn't listen to you much because they played their own games and they have their own agendas at that time.
I don't think that's the case. I think Douglas Hurd, who was Foreign Secretary during all the time that happened, was as helpful as he could be. Of course, we're all democratic politicians. You can't persuade the cabinet. And I think Major was too. There was a majority in the cabinet which were not really committed to having British troops in the UN. There was a lot of reluctance to get too heavily involved in European capitals, and particularly the ones that counted, France and Britain.
Let me ask you about Izetbegovic, because you just mentioned him a few moments ago. You said that you had a good relationship with Milošević, but what was your relationship with Izetbegovic? Was it possible to work with him at that time and to reach the agreements about what you were trying to do here?
Yes, and when the Vance-Owen peace plan collapsed and was disowned by America first and then by the others, Vance retired, and Vance said to me, why don't you give up? I said, well, I've walked away from quite a lot of political battles by retiring and resigning. I think this one I must stick it out. And I did stick it out, and it was very difficult. But, you wear different hats. I was trying to get a peace, and Hurd was then the Foreign Secretary. The Americans not being prepared to use NATO to support the Vance-Owen peace plan, they had to give it up and they had to try and find another way. And I've said to Douglas Hurd, If I was in your position, I would do what you've done, which is to disown the plan because you can't carry the Americans. But I'm not in your position. So I'm going to go on fighting for the Vance Owen peace plan. In the end of the day, if you look at the Dayton Accords and the Vance Owen peace plan, there's not a hell of a lot of difference.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because your plan was provinces, and we got the two of them at the moment. They're not functioning particularly well. But before I ask you about that, you said that the Srebrenica was inevitable, but here in Bosnia and Herzegovina now we have people like Milorad Dodik, who's the leader of Republika Srpska at the moment, who's often is negating that the genocide happened in Srebrenica in July of 1995. What is your assessment of that, about genocide and everything what has happened in 95?
Well, it was a terrible tragedy that Europe, in our day and age, should have had such an appalling act of genocide committed, with all of us in many ways either on the ground or near the ground or trying to get settlements. And of course, it brought about a peace settlement because it meant that America dropped its objections to having NATO, and Clinton accepted that American aircraft would be used as part of NATO in bombing the Serbs' forces, and particularly those identifiable with General Mladic. So what I didn't do was answer your question about Izetbegovic. I liked Izetbegovic, but after the Vance Owen peace plan was disowned, I felt I should resign. And I went to talk to him, and I said, I feel I should resign because I've let you down. I promised that I would try and get this through, but I failed. He persuaded me not to resign. That was a very generous act on his part, but it does indicate to you that you could have a man-to-man, friendly, honest relationship. And he knew that it was failed, not because of me or Vance, it had failed because we had not got agreement with America and couldn't get agreement with America. And it was not solved until the genocide and America agreeing that NATO could be used, and NATO used force on General Mladic's forces and changed the attitude of both Milošević and Mladic. So sometimes, there's an expression in diplomacy, the doctrine of ripe time, R-I-P-E, ripe time. The time was never ripe for a settlement. And sadly, we had to have, and tragically, a genocide before we saw that the time was long overdue to force a settlement. And that's why I say to people, I know there are dissatisfactions at the moment. I know there are pressures in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I watch this very carefully. I don't say anything because I don't want to make life difficult for my successors. But this I do say about the present. Do not try and change the map. Do not try and change the Dayton Accords at this time in our history. There isn't the basic understanding in all the other countries that needed to be around to start playing around in Bosnia and Herzegovina and changing the Dayton Accords. Time may come when they'll have to be reviewed. I suspect it will, but it is not now, and it is too dangerous now to make those changes. And I say that in the belief and hope that it will help those who are grappling with the problems that I had to grapple with for nearly 3 years.
But at the moment, people like President of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, and also Russians are trying to influence some events here through Milorad Dodik, who's the leader of Republika Srpska, but also we have other malign influences here in the region. Do you think that the United Kingdom should play a significant more role here in the region, especially because your government has a special envoy here for Western Balkans, your colleague at the House of Lords, Lord Stuart Peach, and any other country which is significant has a special envoy for the Balkans, but the region is still troubled, from Kosovo to Bosnia to Serbia, to relationship between countries, even those who are members of NATO and European Union.
Well, I'm very glad that Britain has a representative, and with a past history of being a military figure. I think he's very knowledgeable, wise man, and I think he should be listened to. And there are others from other countries. I think you'll find they're all saying the same thing. Do not make changes at this moment. Don't play around. We will have to get better levels of understanding in the wider area and the region, and a more settled future. And we should go on talking above all to the politicians in the Republic of Serbia. Serbia itself is a very important country, and you won't get a solution nowadays for Bosnia-Herzegovina without it being wholeheartedly supported by Serbia as well. It's an important country. I watch it very carefully. I know it has difficulties even at this moment over this very difficult mining question. But Serbia is a great country, and it has to be part of any changes in Dayton. They have to be on board for it and understand it and work with it. And I think that's a change in the situation. When I was there, they were not so responsive, they were not so well led, they were not very courageous, and they're different now, and they must resist the blandishments of the Russians and play a constructive role. If Serbia plays a constructive role, then peace is possible.
And one last question for the end of this interview. Many here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Western Balkans would blame you, particularly you, not others that much, but you for some reason, for many things that happened in the 1990s and what didn't happen in 1990s. Some would say that you betrayed Bosnia and Herzegovina because you played and worked with Milošević and Karadzic and Mladic and Tudjman and everybody else. Do you regret anything regarding your time and your work here? And if you have a chance now to change something except achieving peace, what would that be?
Your image is frozen. I don't know if it looks as if it's all frozen your end. Of course we regret things that happened, and if it eases people's conscience to make me a scapegoat, do it. Don't worry me. I did my best, and I gave up nearly 3 years of my life with a family of young people, children who I didn't see for long periods of time, and loaded on my wife and others. And I did it because they thought it was worthwhile me doing it. And I believe many people believe that. And all I can say is whenever I went to the Europeans and said, I think my time is up, I need somebody else, they spent the whole time trying to persuade me to stay. But there we are. Of course I had to talk to Milošević. Of course I had to talk to Mladic. Of course I had to talk to President Izzetbegović, President Tudjman, all of these people, and non-stop, hour after hour after hour. And I was lied to by many people, hour after hour too. And that was the experience of Vance, and then later the experience of Stoltenberg. We were united, the three of us, separately, first Vance and me, and then Stoltenberg and me. And there was no time when the negotiators split on what to do. And I think the honest answer is the people who were split were the ambitious politicians who lied to us. And they've all, most of them, been tried in courts of law and found guilty. So I think if you want a scapegoat, don't worry me, say what you like. All I can say is a lot of people in the UN, in UNPROFOR, spent many parts of their life trying to help you to a settlement. Some of them were killed. It wasn't easy flying around in our little white plane and arrive on the ground and see the tail with bullet holes run through it, who've been having a pot shot on the ground as we tried to fly into the remote airfields and speak to people, as we tried to get UNHCR lorries with food in to the places that really need them, not the armed forces that were fighting each other, but the villages where there was malnutrition and bad health and often signs of vitamin deficiencies. They were on very inadequate food. A lot of our effort was spent on keeping convoys, humanitarian convoys, open and going through to remote mountain villages where the circumstances were dreadful and health problems as well. All I can tell you is, for all the loss to my family life and to my personal life, I don't regret the nearly 3 years I was there. I'm glad that some months before Srebrenica, I was not there. I don't know whether I would have handled it differently, but there were many opportunities, many times when we came close to Srebrenica. And the UN must learn that if you want to declare safe areas anywhere in the world, you've got to provide enough troops to make them really safe. The UN and the officials were told that if we were going to have these safe areas in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we needed a substantial number of forces, an increase of over 13,000 of UN troops. We got barely 600.
Lord Dawid Owen, thank you so very much for your generous time and for this interview. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
It's a pleasure for me too. Thank you. And I hope you all have good luck. And I hope peace comes and stays. And I hope we will eventually get a proper settlement. But don't play around with Dayton at this moment.